construction and about design is that it sits right at the heart, right at the nexus of a cross point between where we as human beings use resources from our world, from our planet, to turn them into something that creates shelter for us.
Welcome to the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk podcast, a regular discussion with building industry professionals. This is Senior Editor Patrick McComb. I'm joined by Ace McArleton, General Director and Managing Partner for New Frameworks, a high-performance home builder in Burlington, Vermont. You can find the Fine Homebuilding Pro Talk podcast and the original Fine Homebuilding podcast at finehomebuilding.com/podcast. Leave feedback and ask questions there too. Does it sound like I've done that a few times by this point, Ace?
Maybe just a few.
I'm grateful that you're on the show today. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome. I'm glad to be here too.
Are you guys all healthy and everything okay at home?
We are, which is great. Yeah, we're very, very glad that we are all healthy.
And you have a new baby, right?
I do, yeah. Hopefully you won't hear her in the background, but yeah, she's going down for her second nap this afternoon. She's 15 months.
15 months?
Yeah, 15 months. Mm-hmm.
That's like the golden age of babyhood.
I know, it's pretty good.
Congratulations.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been great.
Can you tell me how you became a home builder? You're trained as a mason, am I correct?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, that kind of bumps you forward to my early 20s and how I got into it. But
we'll start wherever you want.
Sure. It starts a little. Yeah, my so growing up as a kid in Chicago, the suburbs of Chicago, a family friend of my grandparents who had actually no surviving family left his house to my family. So he wasn't related to us, by blood, but so we had this kind of amazing thing come into our lives when I was 6 years old. And that house was really cool. It was a farmhouse that it was kind of late 1800s that the architect Harold Zook, who was somebody who worked a lot in the Chicago area, did a major renovation on. So the house was amazing. It had these really cool sloping shingled, very complicated roof shape, actually, sort of a hip roof with rounded corners and all cedar shakes, and it was stucco and had these cool round windows and just these amazing architectural details. And it was just a super cool place to grow up as a kid. So we were there from when I was 6 years old until 12 years old. So I feel like it was actually that experience. There were secret rooms in the building. There were secret passageways in the building. It was so cool. So I think that experience, and then also, I had some family who were in the machine trades. So they were, gear machining and machine shop work. And many of them own their own businesses and were either entrepreneurs or self-employed. So I think that combination of being really inspired by this really cool home that we were so lucky to get to live in for a short time when I was a kid, and then watching my family be involved in a different kind of trades work, but trades work all the same, where you have that satisfaction of building something with tools in your hands, are really the reasons that I got into the trades.
Did your family work on the house, or was it in pretty good condition that you didn't need to? So where did the fun part come from? Just the house? Just exploring it. Yeah, the actual existence of the building itself, and just as a kid, finding those secret rooms, finding those passageways. Your friends must have thought it was awesome too.
Oh, they loved it. Yeah, and really stood out, because we were in the suburbs of Chicago, so everybody else's houses looked very cookie cutter and very quote unquote normal. Our house did not, and so it really stood out and brought so much joy and interest to my friends and other kids in the neighborhood and whatever, and ourselves. So yeah, I think it was mostly that.
Awesome. Can you tell me about your company, New Frameworks? For starters, you describe your company as natural builders. Is that correct? Is that an oversimplification?
I don't know. Language is a funny thing, right? Natural building is a term that kind of is maybe a little bit, I don't know. It comes out of a certain time in history, and it meant a certain thing, I think.
What do you think it meant?
Yeah, I think it meant kind of coming out of the back to the land movement, I think, in the 60s and the 70s of, folks saying, hey, what do we want to sort of rediscover, if you will, about the natural past where we were close to the land, So I think it comes out of that time. And, a lot of those impulses were really good. They were people wanting to say, how can we be closer to the things that make our lives possible rather than being kind of so separated from the land and from natural materials, quote unquote. So I think it's a really good thing where that comes from. But I think for myself and one of my primary business partners, who many of you may know, Jacob Dever-Racusin, we just felt like we wanted to take it in a different direction from staying in that place of saying, how do we bring natural materials and working with them out of this kind of backwoods idea where we're like opting out of society and rather say, hey, wait a minute, why is anyone acting as if, a piece of straw, which is a cellulosic material, exactly as dense packed cellulose is, which is now very commonly used, those materials are not actually quite as different as people might think on the surface. So I think a lot of it is about stripping away the preconceived notions and reactivities that people have to these quote unquote hippie materials, and instead saying, hey, look, a material is a material. Let's look at it for all the benefits that it has and all the uses that it could have.
But how did you get introduced to these materials? Like they're outside the mainstream. I think you'd agree.
Yeah, well, less and less every day, but yes. Well, it's a cool story, actually. I was working in the Bay Area as a tile setter apprentice and learning through the union kind of weekend school there, and working, in a union for a union shop for a tile company there. And then when I moved to Vermont, it was just a very different kind of landscape in terms of what was available for tile mason work. So I ended up doing a bunch of different things, but one of the things that I did was I met a young woman. So I was waiting tables and bartending to make money to start my business. And I met her doing that. And she was this just really incredible, bold, intelligent, skilled young woman who had built her first house when she was 19 years old and trained in the tradition of natural building. So she had trained with a lot of the kind of classic founders of the trade, like Yanto Evans and others. So she had trained learning cob. And
this was in Vermont,
where she learned in Vermont. Uh-huh. Yeah. So we were working together in Vermont, and she ended up getting hired by a woman who wanted Amber Wiggett to build her a timber frame straw bale house and studio. And so Amber, who had been talking with me at work, said, hey, what are you doing? Do you want to come join my crew? I'd like to have an all women's natural building company in Vermont. And I said, well, I would love to come and join your company. That sounds amazing. But can it be an all women and transgender crew because I identify as transgender? And she said, absolutely. So we had, as far as we know, the very first, natural building company with all women and transgender people in Vermont. So we built that building from foundation to finish. And this was in 2002, I believe.
Where is the place?
It's in Tunbridge, Vermont.
Okay.
Yep. And still going great, still standing, good relationship with the clients. So I learned from her, actually, those particular techniques and practices, because I had come from a more conventional experience working in commercial construction in the Bay Area, which was very different, let me tell you, from a all women transgender natural building company in Vermont.
In rural Vermont.
Yeah, very different.
That's fascinating. So the structure, were you guys worried about problems with it down the road? Like, did you want to do like moisture testing years later? Like, this was uncharted territory, I'm going to say, or maybe I'm wrong.
No, I don't think you are wrong. I think what you're referencing is that the natural building technologies, which they are technologies and they are particular engineering and particular design strategies that are required to do them properly. I think that has been an evolving science. And one of the core things that I learned from practicing natural building in Vermont is that you cannot take the principles that were applied in, Arizona and apply them in Vermont. And that was what many people were doing in the beginning, in their enthusiasm, in their, back to the landness and whatever, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, even 90s. And there's still some of it going on where, those particular design details that are not appropriate for a cold and wet place like we have, where we have a lot of seasonal and, kind of just fluctuation around, moisture and temperature. So that's really been a huge focus of my career here, is figuring out how we engineer and design for these materials appropriately in a cold and wet climate. And so that's been the focus of new frameworks, honestly, is to really, yes, test. You brought up testing. We did, I can never remember the exact year, but maybe it was 2009, 2010, we did a research study where we went to all of the straw bale buildings that we had built in the Northeast. And there were 9 of them that we tested in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and New York to do moisture. We did both pin and scan surface. We did probe testing at various layers. And then we did blower door tests and infrared camera imaging to basically try to understand better how those homes were performing and what was happening with the straw in the plastered wall assembly that we had installed. And so that was actually really a great process. Jacob and I did that as a way to support the work that we were doing for our book, which we published somewhere, I think, around 2010, 2011.
You got to give the name now.
Oh, the Natural Building Companion.
Okay.
Yeah, anyone's welcome to go find it. Of course, like anything, we're like, oh, it's so outdated, we have to release an update. But there's still good stuff in there. But the point of it was, what we were advocating in there is what we call high performance natural building. So we're looking for bringing together and connecting all of the work that's been done within our trades community to really push understanding envelopes, understanding air sealing, understanding insulation, understanding building science as relating to our buildings, because we need that performance for during the life of the building. But we also need, I believe, and New Frameworks believes, to look at the materiality and the full process of how the materials are sourced, where they're grown or processed, how they're transported, and then the end of life for that material. So looking more at the full life cycle of the building for the materials as well as the performance during the life of the building is what we're trying to do in New Frameworks, is to connect those two things together. So bringing that same rigor and high quality that we bring to and expect in our high performance wall assemblies and building assemblies, using natural materials as well. And so, yeah, that takes a ton of testing, a ton of research, a ton of, kind of field testing that we're doing, innovation, because nobody's ever tried doing that before.
Right.
We did, anyway.
Please, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, we tried sub-slab Roxol. I think we were one of the first companies who was willing to put it sub-slab before they certified it sub-slab. And the reason for that is that we were really trying to get away from foam and figure out what we could do as an alternative for sub-slab. Now, talk about cold and wet, right? I mean, we're not going to be putting straw bales, below grade. That's not appropriate. That's not what we're looking to do. But so, that was an example of something that we tried when that wasn't necessarily the thing that was, certified or ready. So one of the roles I think that New Frameworks has played in the kind of like ecology of our trades community, if you will, is kind of being out on that experimental edge and trying to cut a path for others to say, hey, we use this thing. Here's how we used it. This is the testing that we showed. Here are all the numbers that result from this, from a climate perspective, from a performance perspective. And then let people make their own decision. Really, I mean, that's kind of what it's about. So,
have you made any mistakes? Stuff that you do differently now?
Come on. Goodness, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, I should have thought of those in advance.
Well, you knew I was going to ask you. That wasn't on our script, but
wasn't on our script. I wonder what is the best one I can think of. I mean.
So let me start you off here. The things that always scare me about straw bale, and people who listen to this show have heard my reservations of it. If it gets wet, it's going to take a very long time to dry, right? So my supposition is that moisture management is key, or you're going to have rotting hay bales. Am I right?
Well, couple things. One, hay is not the term that you want to use, and I'm not trying to word
be pedantic,
police you,
right?
Patrick. Yeah, no, I'm really not trying to word police you. It's more because hay actually is a food, so that's appropriately given to animals as food. Whereas because there's a ton of nutritive content in that part of the plant, so it is actually really important that we say straw because it means that it's the woody, stalk of the plant. It's not meant for nutrition and nourishment. It does not have a ton of nitrogen in it. So anyway, so that's why. But Absolutely. I mean, as with, frankly, any building material, I mean, I don't know who's pulled like old fiberglass out of, frankly, a 1999 built house. Like,
Yeah,
so, I
it's
mean,
disgusting.
yeah, I'm like, cry to me about what moisture does to building materials. I mean, yes, we are all on that same page. But I think what we have found and what our study found, which I found very impressive about straw, is that it's actually tremendously resilient to moisture. So we had that same house that I'm telling you about, that Tunbridge building that was the first building that I was involved with, that was a timber frame straw bale, had an intersecting porch that was between. So there was a studio that was built with straw bale, and then a house that was built with straw bale, and there was an intersecting kind of deck between the two. So there was an issue with the flashing at the connection of that deck to the studio, where it had failed. And so there was actually water that was streaming down the wall right at this one connection point to the straw wall. So we thought, oh man, this is going to be a real problem. We're going to have to go and excavate out this whole section and rebuild this whole section. Instead, what we found is that in that area, it was actually the driest that it was in other parts of the building, because it was drying to the outside. So the inner part of the wall was super dry. And then as we moved out to the outer layers, it was getting progressively drier and drier. And one of the reasons that we think that's true is because we're attending to building a vapor open wall assembly that also has built-in drying capacity, which for us in that particular straw bale assembly is, a core of the bale itself. So, most straw bales are 14 inches by 18 inches, and you can stack them either way. But you have either a 14 or an 18-inch cavity that is very densely packed straw. And then you have a rind on either side of directly applied clay, sand, lime plaster, and then for us a top coat of lime sand plaster. So those two plasters that are coating that core of that cellulosic material are what's called hydrophilic, not hydrophobic, hydrophilic. So they're drawing moisture into the clay. So the body of the clay itself, clay is very thirsty, which like most people kind of have an intuitive awareness of when you see clay, anywhere, or, an example of masks in a spa, right? You put it on your skin to suck the like quote unquote impurities out, right? It's because clay, the molecule itself is very hydrophilic. So, having that rind of clay on the outside is pulling and sucking moisture from the bales into itself. And then it's also vapor permeable. So on the vapor permeability scale, clay is 18 to 20 perms. And just as a sense of perspective for people, cement or cement plaster is something like 0 to 1. So it's super, super low, whereas clay is very vapor open. So the combination of being hydrophilic, which for whatever reason I'm having trouble saying today, and being vapor permeable is the combination of things that properly prepares that straw bale to last for a very long time and stay both dry and air sealed and functioning well as an insulation, because we all know when insulation gets wet, it's compromised in its R value and its ability to do its job.
Can I assume that the stuccos you're using would be compromised if you put latex paint on them, for example? So my assumption is that there's no coating on this, or is there a coating on the interior or exterior?
It's a good question, and it gets fairly complicated, which you can probably imagine, depending on.
I'm already finding it complicated.
Right? I know everybody thinks like, you throw these hay bales on a wall, and what is it? There's actually a lot going on to do it well, which we're trying to do, or certainly like is our intention. Latex paint is your question, right? So yeah, things that retard the vapor permeability of the wall, depending on where they are and depending on kind of what the full picture of the building is and how it's meant to function, are often discouraged, I guess is what I would say. And latex, because in and of itself, it's a petrochemical base and a toxic, paint, we would move away from that anyway if we were going to recommend a coating. We do coat them both on the interior and the exterior with different kinds of paint. You can use a silica-based paint. There are other kinds of natural paints that we use, like you can use a clay paint or a lime paint.
What do you like best?
I think that the best thing is to do an exposed plaster on the interior that you paint with a clay or lime paint or a silica paint, they're all great. They all have different functions. You would use a lime paint or a silica paint somewhere where you wanted more moisture resistance. Clay is not going to have resistance to, rain or water or splashback from a sink or that sort of thing. So you would use them in different parts of the house. The clay would be beautiful in, a bedroom or a living area where you're not risking a lot of moisture.
Are those trowel-on products, or are they brushed and rolled on?
They're brushed and rolled on. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, gosh, the world of finishing these things is so huge and beautiful. I mean, you can just leave the plaster as its own finish by itself. You can dye that coat to a certain color using pigments. You can leave it its natural color, or you can top coat it with a paint applied, coating. So it leaves a ton of options for, the aesthetic and the desire for the particular location. But I think that's the best on the interior. And then on the outside of the wall, I think the best is to finish it with some kind of siding, because even though you can do exterior plaster well, and there are things you can do to make sure it lasts and does well in exposure. I mean, we've got buildings that, are on 20 years and they have not even been lime washed, which is one of the treatments we do on the exterior in that time, and they're doing fine. Like, one of the sides that's a little bit more exposed could use another coat, but it's like, wow, after 20 years, okay. Yeah. So yeah, it can work. But I do find that, over the super long term, I think it's easier to replace and repair, some cedar shakes or some cedar board, clapboards, or what have you. And I like the rain screen. I think that's a great just finished detail for a building, especially in this climate. So I like the combination of the rain screen on the exterior with the plaster on the interior.
How do you fasten the battens or whatever to then attach the siding to the straw bales?
Framing.
So you have a stud wall on the exterior of the...
Doesn't have to be a full stud wall. Could be. Sometimes we use 2x2s. It depends on what the structure is that, how tall is the wall? What is the overhang? What are the other pieces of framing that are around? And sometimes we run horizontal nailers. There's different framing strategies basically that you can use for that. But yes.
What are the biggest challenges since the COVID-19 outbreak? I've heard of certain products and materials that are suddenly hard to get. My suspicion is, though, that your company doesn't use a lot of that stuff, although I'm sure you use sawn lumber like everybody. But can you talk about that a little for me?
Well, it's interesting you bring up sawn lumber. Actually, for the most part, we use locally sawn lumber and timber, which has not experienced a disruption in our state as much because loggers and sawyers are able to, conform to social distancing when they're in their forest.
And when your market is nearby, you don't have these other problems.
Right. Yeah. So we've been lucky in that way. We have not had issues with framing lumber or any kind of timber and lumber, actually, which we're glad for. But I think the biggest things have just been shipping times. We do sometimes, like we ordered an order of Ethos paint. I don't know if people have ever used that paint, but very much recommend it as a really great non-toxic and completely sort of VOC-free paint. But so they were having some shipping times that were extended. We've had to adjust. I mean, like many of us, our project schedules have, gone haywire essentially. So there's been a lot of that, of adjusting and being nimble and flexible with shipping of materials. But yeah, I feel like overall it's actually been smoother than I would have anticipated.
Custom builders all over the country have been talking about a huge uptick in remodeling by people who live in urban areas and who are retreating to their second homes or trying to buy them. Have you seen that too in Vermont?
Well, I know about it in that I've read, plenty of articles in our local paper about it, and people have been talking about it. We ourselves, well, I guess that's not true. We have one client who is lined up for next year who's in that exact position, who were, living in the Manhattan area. But they are originally from here. And so it's more about going back to their, family's original farm and reworking the building because they're going to move back with their young family. So I guess that's true. In our own practice, we've seen that with one client. But I have heard about that happening in our state quite a bit. What I think we've seen more of is that people who are working from home, people who, have had to lock down or be, somewhat more in their homes than they would normally, are all looking around and saying, Okay,
This
now
place
it's
is a
time to
dump.
do that addition. Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
Martin Holliday has a piece on GBA now talking about the remodeling of his mudroom, which he said had been dysfunctional for 30 years, and he finally has had the time to deal with it.
Go Martin.
He's raised the point in something I had never considered. He's like, you should make your mudroom conditioned. And like, I never thought of that. But of course, like no one wants to sit in a cold space and take their clothes off,
Take
right?
your boots off, yeah. Mm-hmm. Or put on cold boots, which is never fun either.
What can tradespeople, construction companies, the industry do to make residential construction more inclusive? What would you like to see happen to make it easier for folks who are different to be in the industry?
Love that question, Patrick. What a great question, especially right now, given the time that we're in nationally, seeing such a amazing kind of opening of the dialogue and conversation around particularly race and racism and white supremacy, and also more and more dialogue around gender and sexuality, and including people who are within those categories of difference, as you say, within those different things. Yeah, I mean, so much to be done. I mean, I think one of the things that at least I try to do, it's hard to kind of tell everyone what they should do, but, doing your own work as a tradesperson to understand your own kind of social position and all the things that contribute to who you are, I think is a really great place to start. Like just starting with that self-education, understanding, what has brought you to be who you are, and making that visible to yourself can be a really great part of that education. And then, reaching out to and listening to others who have a different social experience and listening to what that's like for them in the trades, I think is a really great starting point. Like, often listening and building relationships and connecting is always the place to start with anything, right? So I think that's a really important place to start. I'm a part of the Northeastern Sustainable Energy Association, New Frameworks, and our company is. And one of the most recent things that we've done there is I helped to start a diversity caucus. So one of the things that I believe is to be true is that when you have a mainstream where we kind of expect, okay, here's what's normal, here's what it means to kind of be within the mainstream. And then you have somebody or some people or some practices, I think natural building falls into that as well, that fall within that marginal place where it's like, okay, that's kind of over there, that's kind of different, that's not the norm, right? So the way that you renegotiate power between the mainstream and the margin is you have to make that margin visible. So you have to say, we're here, look, we're here. And so part of what the Diversity Caucus does within NESE is to make visible all of us who are coming from different gender identities, sexualities, economic backgrounds, immigration status, disability, ability status, and race and ethnicity. Yeah. So making that super visible, a place for people of color, a place for transgender people to come and say, this is my trade, this is my industry. And I think that is a really important point of power building that needs to be supported and needs to be created within our community. And then secondly, the other thing that I have just started doing also within NESE, I'm a part of the Building Energy Bottom Lines program there, which I really recommend to anyone. It's a triple bottom line, so people, planet, profit kind of model for running our businesses. And we're starting an anti-racism action group as a part of that. And so we just had our first meeting last week, and 50 people came from, representing at least probably 30 different companies across the Northeast. And they said, we talked about what can we do to improve the culture and the practice of our companies along anti-racist lines to help deconstruct white supremacy within our trade. And we talked about what can we do on an organizational level around, the Building Energy Conference that NESE puts on. So this is just one example of within this trades group that exists saying, let's work together to figure out how to do this better. Because I believe, like many very smarter people than me have said before, that it actually diminishes all of us when one person is diminished. So, if we actually are going to live better lives and be more human, more fully human, if we actually rebalance and change the way that our society is working. And that comes down to our companies as well. And, one of the things I know you'd wanted to talk about too, Patrick, is, how do we bring young people into the trades? What's the future for the trades? Would I invite my child or my children, would I say, yes, become a builder? And the answer to that is absolutely yes, 100%, hands down. It is the best thing in my life that I'm a builder. It makes me full of joy every day. Getting to create things out of nothing is a privilege, and a joy. And I think what is really cool about construction and about design is that it sits right at the heart, right at the nexus of a cross point between where we as human beings use resources from our world, from our planet, to turn them into something that creates shelter for us and is then a social use. And so it sits at this incredible junction between natural ecology and the way we work with the land and with the way that we understand ecology and our relationship to the planet, and the way that we understand our relationship to each other and to ourselves. And so that nexus point that we are working at as builders is such an incredibly fruitful and growthful place where we can really address both social justice and ecological justice together in the work that we do, and not make it this pie in the sky, kind of ethereal, like theoretical thing. But it's about, when I choose my framing lumber, am I helping to get the, Vermonter who's a, working class family down the road who's like going to lose their farm if they don't find, ways to work the land? How do I support them when I'm going to build my building? So those examples of, those tangible ways that we're going to actually build the world that we want to see through our actions every day in every project that we take, I think that to me is the promise of this work that we're doing, and why I love being a builder, and why I see it as the future in terms of why would we tell young people to get into the trades. We can be heroes. I think that builders and designers are, I've said this, and Jacob and I and Chris have said this in our various talks that we've been giving lately, but we could be climate heroes, among other things. I mean, it's not just about the climate. I mean, we certainly have to save the climate, right? That's critical. But we can also be community heroes. We can essentially, draw down carbon, which, we didn't really talk about why build with straw bale. It's not just because it's quote unquote natural and let's just be natural. It's because it literally sucks carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which we desperately need right now. So plant-based materials suck carbon out of the atmosphere, store them in the body of the plant, and then you lock that plant using good engineering and good design and good science into buildings that then become storage reservoirs for that carbon that we, burned a little too much of, right? So that's what we're talking about here. So that's like an incredible, how can we save the future? How can we be this dynamic, attractive industry for young people? I mean, I think, one, be a climate hero. Two, be a place that is genuinely inclusive, which means that we're going to need to really change the toxic masculinity culture of the trades.
Yeah.
And, we didn't talk a lot about this, but that was what I hated about my apprentice experience in California, was how incredibly full of toxic masculinity it was. And what I mean by that is, masculinity in and of itself, I'm a fan. I identify as a transgender butch, and I identify on the queer masculine spectrum. So this is not about hating on masculinity. I think masculinity in and of itself is great. It's one of the diverse ways that we are as people.
But guys on some construction sites are just jerks. They are just mean, obnoxious people.
Right.
It's terrible.
So there's two different things, right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. There's masculinity in a positive, healthy, wonderful, diverse way. And then there's like toxic masculinity, where we're hurting ourselves and other people through the practice of that quote unquote masculinity. And for me, that's the key part of the trades. We want to move into the future. We want to, a lot of colleagues will say to us, hey, we just can't find any carpenters. We just can't find any apprentices. Nobody, it's so hard to find. I have to tell you, Patrick, we are batting people away from my company. And I think it's because we're doing something, we're trying to be visionary. We're trying to say, we can do this better. We can have a culture that is inclusive of people around gender, around sexuality, around race, around ethnicity, around all these differences. That's who we are. We're going to make that central, and we're going to make that normal. And we're going to do that in all these ways. So the culture of my company is one thing that I think people are attracted to. I think the second thing is the work that we're doing in the world, because we're saying, you know what? The trades is beautiful. The trades is wonderful. We need it. It's an essential human need to have buildings. Like, we have to have shelter, right? But guess what? We can do it in a way that doesn't actually make us worse off in 20 years. Like, we can do it in a way where we actually are proud of what we've done, and we've improved the human potential for survival rather than diminishing it. And so I think, like, the combination of those two things, that's what I think the trades needs. You know, we need to deconstruct the toxic masculinity and the white supremacy. We need to refocus on how we can work in such a way that we enrich and heal our communities and our planet rather than being a tax on it. And I think we can do that.
Thanks so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks to Ace McArleton for joining us, and thanks to all of you for listening. Please remember to send us your comments, questions, and suggestions to fhbpodcast@taunton.com, and please like, comment, or review us however you're listening. It helps other folks find our podcast. Stay safe, everybody. Thank you so much for listening, and happy building.